I was born in Pennsylvania, but my dad was in the military, so we traveled quite a bit. Spent some time in White Sands, New Mexico, Letterkenny Army Depot in Pennsylvania, spent overseas in Germany, a bunch of years over there, and then I graduated high school in Huntsville, Alabama, when my dad got stationed at Redstone Arsenal. I think, my dad being in the military kind of gave me the, I guess, the discipline and the intestinal fortitude. I'm not sure exactly what you would call it, but the motivation, I guess is more of a proper word for that, to join the military. As a kid, played cowboys and Indians and played Army soldier man and stuff like that. So to me, being in and around the military, my dad's friends that were in the military, it was not uncommon and it wasn't foreign to me. It was a lifestyle that I felt comfortable with. Planned on going into the military, and that's what I did. I was in junior ROTC in high school, was surrounded by that when I was in high school. And again, my father was in the military, he was pretty disciplined. So, I didn't find it to be a culture shock or anything like that. It was kind of like what Forrest Gump say, that square peg, round hole thing. I mean, it was a good fit. I didn't have any issues or problems with it. My goal when I joined the military was to go in Special Forces. Even when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be a Green Beret, and I went after that, and whatever obstacles were in my way, I overcame them and got to where I needed to be. Well, I started off as a support guy, a commo support guy, when I was 18, and then I actually went to the Q course when I was 20. So that worked out just perfect for me. I've been in 15 years straight as a Special Forces guy, not as an active duty Special Forces guy. In my particular class, I was the youngest guy in my class at that time. Now there were guys who were younger that had gone before me, and there were guys that had gone that were younger after me. Years ago, the Army had the Special Forces baby program, I think is what we referred to it as. And I'd met plenty of guys who came in when they were 18 years old and went straight to the Special Forces Q course back then. And then they had stopped that for years because they weren't needed. Then after 9/11, they started that program back up. And then I think at one point they lowered the age. I'm not sure what the age limit was, but at another point I think it's now 21 before you can do that. But yeah, so when I started off, I went through selection. That was what we had to go through back then, SFAS. And I started off no problems, went through selection first time, and then I started off, my first MOS was supposed to be a commo guy, and for some reason I just couldn't get that Morse code down. So I didn't make it through the Morse code portion, and the Army in its infinite wisdom decided that I was going to be an 18 Charlie and that Special Forces engineer. I wasn't a big fan of building stuff, to tell you the truth. I had built a couple things, and I'm glad I have that skill set under my belt, but it wasn't my niche per se. So when I got out of the Q course, I went to third group initially, and then after a couple years in third group, I went to language school out in Monterey, California, and the Army in its infinite wisdom decided to send me out there to learn Spanish. So when I came back from Spanish school, I checked into 7th group, and that's where I went. So I spent most of my time in 7th group in Special Forces, and like you said, that area of operations is Central and South America. So, being a Spanish speaker, I'd gone to countries like El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, you name it, and had been to many of those countries. And then I actually got tagged to go be an instructor. And so I spent 3 years in the schoolhouse at the Special Warfare Training Group, and I was an anti-terrorism instructor. So I taught a course back then called INTAC, Individual Terrorism Awareness. And we taught a lot of awareness stuff, a lot of classes, and we also got to do a bunch of driving, and we got to do some shooting while we were there too. So I'm really glad I had that opportunity. Got some instructor courses. I went to the NRA Firearms instructor courses while I was there, and their NRA law enforcement instructor course. And I was very happy about the time that I did as an instructor. It was one of the few places that I actually felt that the majority of the people on that committee really enjoyed being there, and we really enjoyed working together. Well, I'd say one of the best parts about being in Special Forces, being a Green Beret, was all of the traveling and the training. I mean, let's face it, there's so much training that they threw at us that people would pay top dollar for that we would get for free. For example, you know, I got my blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from Hoist Gracie himself when he came down to Fort Bragg, you know, and I got that for free. I didn't pay a dime for any of the classes. You know, I was fortunate enough to be, you know, have mentors and trainers that, you know, had brought him down several times on several occasions, you know. Same with, you know, we had trained with guys, you know, big name IPSC shooters, competitors, you know, Frank Garcia, you know, Jerry Barnhart, you know, guys like that, you know, would come to Fort Bragg, and, you know, people, again, were paying top dollar for these courses, and we got to train with these guys for free, you know. The travel of being in Special Forces, even back then, it doesn't compare to what it is today. The guys doing the deed today travel far more and work way harder than we did. But even back in the day when we were doing it, before 9/11, you know, it was a rigorous training cycle. You know, so if you weren't doing an MTT in Central South America for 7th Group, you know, then you were on a training cycle, doing something constantly. You know, working a lot of nighttime hours because, you know, reverse training schedule, doing stuff under nods at the hours of darkness. You know, that does take a toll on family. You know, so you know, I spent my last 3 years in the Army on active duty. I spent them in a unit that had what was called a SIF, and you know, the commander's In-Extremis force. So we had a QRF mission and a counterterrorism mission. So we did quite a bit of training. You know, our cycle, our monthly cycle, was the same. We had so few people in there that we had to rotate that cycle back more often than not. So my first week, you know, in the unit was basically spent on the range doing flat range stuff, marksmanship, advanced marksmanship, shooting and moving. Second week would be in the house doing CQB, and then the third week would be culmination exercises or, you know, some type of force on force. And then final week we would do basically a refit, a rekit, and you start clean guns, do your admin, jump, airborne operations, and so on and so forth. And the cycle would start over. So, you know, I was fortunate enough to be in a SIF when we had very few people. So that cycle kept rotating back and forth to me, whereas, you know, maybe guys would be able to skip a cycle. So I got to do that for 3 years almost every month, and it turned into be a very intensive training cycle for those 3 years, and a great opportunity, to tell you the truth. So what I did was my last 3 years there, you know, were spent in that unit, and then I got out and I started immediately contracting. I was out processing the military, and the day after I out processed, I was in Iraq working as a contractor. And there's that saying, you know, be careful what you wish for. And I remember being involved in several incidents as soon as I got on the ground. You know, there were VBIDs, you know, had just barely missed us. There were shootings, vehicle-borne IEDs. Okay. You know, my first day, official day into work, you know, we were getting ready to go through a checkpoint, and right before we got there, it had blown up. And had we been, you know, 30 seconds earlier, we would have been right there in the blast. You know, our motorcade got shot up. You know, I saw guys get shot right in front of me. Guys that, you know, we had to put tourniquets on, and you know, it was interesting that very first week, that everything that guys had said, hey, could happen, literally happened on that first week. And you know, I made mistakes that I'm glad I made them around the right folks that could sit there and correct me and mentor me. It's just, you know, you go to a different place, a different environment, there's always a learning curve, but it needs to be a quick learning curve. I would say in general the American warfighter is in fact the greatest warfighter, you know, on the face of the earth right now. The training opportunities that we have, that the U.S. military has and provides for the soldiers, is second to none. The issue or problem I see is that it's too much at the top. You know, we've got the soft units that get all this training. In my opinion, it needs to be cycled down to, you know, more of the conventional forces. And they've done that to some degree, but in my opinion, just not enough. You know, after so many years of us being involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, yeah, you would think that the military is really doing what they need to do to train the folks. But, you know, as a contractor over there, you know, I got to support the U.S. military. And I got to go out on a convoy with some guys to get from point A to point B, you know. And we had specifically asked, hey, you know, is there anything we need to know about this route? You know, and you know, it was me, and there was a command sergeant major that was with us. and he was a former a soft guy, and we got hit, you know. And the first thing that he says is, "Hey, you know, what's going on here?" And they're like, the soldiers were like, "Hey, this is the same place that we got hit yesterday." And he's like, "You know, when we asked if there was anything we needed to know, don't you think this would have been one of those things that you told us?" You know, and as opposed to doing what, you know, what we expected, where, you know, you would close with and destroy the enemy, we just buttoned up and kept going, you know.
Right.
Just not something that I expected. Now, in a soft unit, you know, I see the exact opposite happen. They get hit, you know, they close with, they destroy, you know, and they have casualties, and then they give a battle damage assessment at the end there. And the other difference is that, you know, with the conventional forces, I saw for the first time why they weren't having battle damage assessment, why they weren't, you know, killing bad guys, because they were spraying and praying, you know. And working with the soft guys that I supported as a contractor, you know, I would see the exact opposite. You guys were aiming their shots, you know, they were taking their time, they were doing what they needed to do to eliminate the threats, you know. So yeah, so, you know, when I first got out, one of the things that was recommended to me, you know, was to create an S Corp or an LLC, so that when you were contracting, you know, there was a method of payment that could take place from the organizations that we worked for. And I created that company, and then the other side of it is I used it to conduct training in between my overseas deployments. So when I was back in the States, you know, Green Ops would train folks. Now, granted, at the time, the majority of the folks that I was training were for other contract companies that were going overseas, or for military folks that were going overseas. And that's how it became, you know, born or branded. Branded, I would say, is more of a thing that's happened within the last 2 years, I'd say, up in Northern Virginia. And that started off with my relationship with the NRA, working out of Northern Virginia. You know, I had access to their range, and according to the, you know, the NRA, the last 5 years running, the most most bought firearm has been the carbine and the AR platform. So, you know, there's a big shift for the use of the carbine. The NRA indoor range had asked for classes, you know, or said that the most sought after class was for new owners of the carbine. And so, you know, with those two things, you know, my name got popped up there, and, you know, they asked if I could run some classes, and I did, and they were successful, and that's what we started off, was running the carbine level 1 courses that we run. There's always an overflow, but what you got to do is, you know, you have to give it to them in small doses. You have to triage the information. You know, you can't overwhelm them. And so what I like to do is give them a certain amount of information and give them the basics. And then hopefully they'll come back for a level 2 or more advanced training. But that would be the ideal thing to do. The other thing to remember is that, you know, in the special operations community, say if I give a 1 or 2 day class, those are just fragments of what a 1 or 2 week program would be in the soft community. You know, if I have guys do, you know, for example, we'll say like an up drill, and they shoot 10 rounds. Well, you know, that's fine, they shot 10 rounds, but they didn't develop that muscle memory that they needed to do. But, you know, in Special Forces, we would go to the range, you know, we may do 100 of those up rounds in full kit, and it's going to be ingrained in you before you leave that range, you know. So, you know, you gotta give them what they need, you know, along with also what they want. I run a advanced concealed carry class, and I've had you know, a lot of folks. I've come down to here to Advantage Group, Nate Stokes, you know, and ran the advanced concealed carry course down here. You know, and Nate, you know, has a lot of trainers that come down here, and he's told me, in his opinion, that I have one of the best, if not the best, concealed carry programs out there. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, I spent a lot of time as a government contractor working overseas, carrying concealed, but also when I was in Special Forces, you know, it was one of the things that we taught at the Anti-Terrorism Training Division was concealed carry to a certain degree. You know, we studied it, we researched it, and then as a Special Forces guy traveling in Central and South America, you know, as a force protection thing, we would typically carry at least one of the guys would carry a gun. You know, initially we started off doing it all wrong, sticking the gun straight down the pants, you know, and we learned. You know, we sought after the knowledge that we needed to do that. You know, imagine working as a government contractor overseas and you get caught carrying a gun, you know. You may be authorized, but you're going to create somewhat of an international incident. So you had to know what you were doing, you know. I mean, even as a military guy working out of an embassy, you know, yeah, you may be authorized to carry a gun, but do the local police understand that? They may not, you know. So either way, it's going to create some of an international incident. And so you wanted to make sure that one, that you did carry concealed and you weren't, you know, exposing that. And then two, you had to be able to get to the gun quickly and rapidly, you know. And I like to incorporate a lot of standards from the competition community into my concealed carry stuff. Yeah, so I like to do a lot of my drills in the time standard or having that pro timer out there. Reason being is that a lot of guys will argue tactics and techniques. I don't like to argue or talk about a technique. I like to simply pull out the pro timer and then just let that decide which was the fastest technique. Because that pro timer doesn't say, hey, you're a barrel-chested freedom fighter, this technique looks more tactical. It gives you an actual time. And then you don't have to discuss or argue with anyone whether what tactic is better, because the bottom line is what is better to have a lower time to be faster than the enemy. And that's the goal and objective of using a pro timer.
You know?
Yeah, so I think that you know, there are plenty of good trainers out there, and I would never dissuade anyone from going to other classes. I think it's a good thing to vary up your training, go to different folks. But one of the things I like to do that I think makes my training a little bit different than some of the other folks is I like to have a lower number of students. I don't like to go beyond 14. I will on occasion. But the other thing is I like to give individual attention to each shooter, you know, as I call an up drill. Enough where that they feel that when they left, that there's something memorable that they can take away and go, hey, I need to work on this. You know, at a minimum, because there's certain things, I could throw out 10, 20 things to somebody, but it's not going to make them better if they're thinking about those 10 or 20 things. But if I can take those one or two things that they're doing and make them that much better by taking away the major problems, I think that's going to be a big issue at the end, or big win. So my training motto, or the company training motto, is why should your training be any less special? And is what I like to do is, in comparison to the average civilian concealed carry, is compare that to what law enforcement and special operations personnel receive. You know, let's look at nationwide, 1992, we discovered that average hit rate for law enforcement was 17%. That means they're hitting 1 out of every 6 shots inside of a bad guy. Where do those other 6 shots go? So as a civilian, you know, civilians, they don't have what's called qualified immunity. They're not working, that's not their job, you know, they're not mandated by the state, the city, or the federal government to protect somebody. So if anything, my opinion is that the law enforcement community is undertrained, but a civilian needs to be more trained, because they don't get 2 weeks of training at a basic police academy and then 1 to 2 times a year training. But yet they're going to be held to a higher standard if you think about it in the end, because again, they don't have that qualified immunity holding them back. So they're going to be open to, you know, not just the criminal court, but also, you know, the civil courts too. You know, there's something to be said for the guy who does that, you know, goes out, he buys a Glock, buys some duty ammo, an extra mag, and says, hey, I'm good to go. I took my 4-hour course, I'm a concealed carrier. You know, that's about the same as saying, you know what, I have an airplane that I bought and 4 hours of training, I'm a pilot. That's not the case. And just like, and I'm sure that we've all ran into those guys that have a guitar, but they're not guitarists, you know. It takes practice and skill, something you need to do over and over and over again. Consistency, continuity, all that needs to be in play there. So I've had a few folks, you know, say, you know, hey, I'm not an operator, I'm not a special forces guy, you know, why should I train with a guy like you? And you know, it's simple. You know, special forces guys by nature are instructors. That was our jobs before 9/11, was we would go to foreign countries and we would train folks. A lot of these people, you know, didn't speak our language, and the education level was not the same as the average American. So you had what you had, and you had to make do, and you had to train these folks. And we did an outstanding job of training these people back in the day. You know, so if I can train, you know, foreign nationals that don't even speak English and may not even have a high school degree equivalency, then I'm sure that I can take the average American who speaks the same language and probably has more than a high school degree. Well, I could probably train them a lot easier and better. You know, and the other thing is there's a misperception about special forces. You know, they think that special forces guys kick down doors and wear full kit all the time, you know. There's plenty of times when you're working in different countries, you know, carrying concealed, when you're back in the States and you're on your own, you have a concealed carry permit, you know. We had the luxury of training with a lot of law enforcement, you know, overseas, and their missions are going to be more similar to that of the concealed carrier, you know, so we would see a lot of that. The other thing is that, as someone who's been separated from the military for more than 10 years, I'm a family man, I'm married, I have kids, so I have to go through the same processes that everyone else does as far as carrying a concealed handgun. Working as in some of these places overseas where, I had to make sure that I didn't necessarily have the rest of an ODA or team backing me up. I had to make sure that, I had a way to get out of Dodge, just like an average civilian carrier, concealed carrier doesn't have people backing him up. You're going to call 911, and you're going to get the heck out of Dodge if you can, or you'll wait for the police to show up. Use of force in a lot of these places have been more strict than they are for civilians concealed carrying in the United States. And a lot of people think that the Special Forces community have this shoot them all, let God sort them out attitude, which of course is not true, And so when people ask about, why should they train with a special operations guy, I don't say you have to. Definitely train with other folks, but don't limit yourself by saying, hey, this is all they do, because that's not the case. Many of us concealed carried for force protection issues in these foreign countries. We carried concealed, doing low profile operations and stuff like that. And then again, being out, a lot of us continue to get, further training. When I was in the military, we went to instructor development courses, 2 weeks at a time, learning how to be a platform instructor, learn about adult theory, adult learning, and so on and so forth. So people, I think, have a misperception about the SOF community, and I think it sorely hurts them in the end.